Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Advancing Climate Action Through Participatory Democracy. My name is Hannah Muhadreen and I'm the Policy and Data Projects Manager at Climate Reality Canada. Thanks so much to everybody for joining us today. I'm coming to you from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is on Treaty 1 territory, the land of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and Dene, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. At this point, I'd like to invite everyone here to introduce themselves in the chat, sharing your name, the community and Indigenous territory you're joining from, and if you'd like a little bit about what brought you here today. Our webinar is marking the launch of a new report commissioned by Climate Reality and researched and written by PhD student Megan Matz. It was made possible by 312 Main Research Shop, a project of the Community Engaged Research Initiative at Fraser University, which supports community-serving organizations by offering research services at low or no cost. So I'd like to extend a big thank you to CERi, as well as their research shop partners, Mitacs, and Bad City Community Foundation. Today we'll be hearing from three speakers. First, Megan will kick things off by making the case for participatory democracy as a tool for advancing climate action and taking us through the highlights of the report. And then we'll hear from a couple speakers who will offer a deep dive into two of the case studies featured in the report. First, we'll hear from Shawn Katz from the Center d'Ecologie Urbaine, who will tell us about Montreal's participatory budget. And then we'll hear from Prest from the Center for Dialogue on the City of Burnaby's Community Assembly. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Megan to tell us about the report.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. So, a lot of us who care about climate change lately are feeling like we are in dangerous territory. The world has already warmed past the 1.5-degree target, and analysis from the UN anticipates that we may approach catastrophic levels of warming by the end of this century. And while international agreements and federal policy on climate mitigation aren't feeling very promising lately, the report we're sharing today seeks to offer a little bit of hope through the policymaking power of municipalities. So, according to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, local government has influence over roughly 50% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. While many types of climate policy fall under provincial or federal jurisdiction, like carbon pricing schemes and decisions on energy infrastructure, municipalities have the opportunity to make bylaws and community plans that guide things like building emissions and transportation networks. For example, municipalities have the power to implement things like road pricing schemes and cycling and walking infrastructure, which can help to embed lower emission pathways. But creating and implementing better, bolder climate policy is not always straightforward. Opposition and uncertainty about how to proceed can stand in the way. Sometimes representatives or the public can be opposed to climate action. So what we're sharing today is a report about the role that public participation can play in making better climate policy, and what strategies we can use to conduct public engagement that's meaningful, useful, and equitable. So let's zoom out for a moment to define our concepts. In the title of this report is the term participatory democracy. What this is an approach to governance that includes people in decision-making more often and more directly than just casting a vote every 4 years to choose who you prefer to make decisions on your behalf. Participatory democracy isn't a system with which we want to replace representative democracy. It's a system that we want to add on to complement the existing democratic representative system. The interest in participatory conceptions of democracy is born from the recognition that we don't have to settle for our existing system. We can fight for better processes that include people more meaningfully and more frequently in policymaking. It also asks more of us as citizens. It asks that we engage with one another, that we listen, that we consider other perspectives. It aspires to support an exchange of experiences in pursuit of fostering greater empathy for our fellow citizens. And there's a whole range of tools and structures for putting the ideas of participatory democracy in place, and that's what this report is all about. But first, I want to make some arguments about why participation is useful in decision making. So if you're someone who's had crummy experiences with public engagement in the past, either as a participant or as a staff facilitator, you might feel like it's a little bit pointless, especially since many of us already know what policies and actions are required to tackle climate change. But I'll argue that engagement does not need to be pointless. There are practical problems that the policy process can address. And if we take on bold approaches to seeking out public input, engagement can contribute to more equitable climate policy. So here are some of those benefits. First, engaging the public in decision-making can boost legitimacy and public acceptance of the climate policy that results from that process. Backlash is less likely if people have felt heard and their input is meaningfully incorporated or considered in policymaking. Second, citizens can take a longer-term view on policy options and their impacts because they don't have to be concerned with 4 or 5-year election cycles like elected officials are. Third, embedding these structures into the policy process can provide opportunities for increased government scrutiny and accountability to citizens by opening up the process and welcoming people in. Engaging a representative sample of the population, as some of these techniques do, can ensure participants hold a variety of experiences, rather than just including the same 5 people who tend to show up, which helps to challenge existing inequalities in public policy. Incorporating more information and opportunities for dialogue into engagements can help build more informed opinions and boost empathy among participants, and also can help counter future absorption of misinformation. Innovative approaches to public engagement on climate action, such as citizens' assemblies, routinely produce high levels of support for more ambitious climate policy. For example, in one instance in Copenhagen, a citizens' assembly agreed unanimously to reduce parking spaces in the city center, even though a third of the assembly members belonged to vehicle-owning households. And lastly, deepening people's connection to democracy is a good idea right now in an era of democratic backsliding. We should be finding opportunities to reignite an active conception of citizenship, to retain a sense of investment in our democratic system, which may help us to collectively be more resilient in the face of creeping fascism and authoritarianism. So in this report, we introduce 4 types of structure that municipalities can use to engage the public in the course of climate policymaking. And note that while our case studies focus in on the climate file, these tools can be used on any policy file. So the 4 types of engagement that we cover in this report are citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, citizen advisory committees, and consultation. Each differ in size, duration, approach, output, and cost. I'll now introduce each method and give a brief introduction to the case studies, highlighting what makes each one interesting. So first up are citizens' assemblies. So this is where a group of residents is convened to discuss a policy issue. An assembly usually follows 3 stages. First, members learn about a policy issue from experts and people with firsthand experience. Second, members deliberate together on what policies could best tackle the issue at hand. And lastly, the members put these policy recommendations to a vote to determine how much support each one has among the assembly. The recommendations are assembled into a report, which is delivered to the government that convened the citizens' assembly. What makes a citizens' assembly neat is that members are selected through sortition or random selection. This random selection process generally uses a computer program to balance participants according to the demographics of the overall population, such as on the basis of gender and age. The idea behind this approach to selection is that it ensures inclusion of a range of life experiences in a policy conversation. So this report features 2 really interesting examples of citizens' assemblies. First is the Burnaby Community Assembly, convened to engage residents on the future of the city as part of the drafting of a new official community plan. And Robin from the Center of Dialogue will have lots more to share on this. The second case is the Bude Area Community Jury on Climate Change. This assembly was actually convened by civil society groups in partnership with one another, rather than the local government, to initiate a community-led response to climate change. So the next type that we looked at is participatory budgeting, which is a process through which residents can deliberate together to make decisions on how to spend public money. Though details differ from one process to another, participatory budgeting generally involves a government allocating a portion of an upcoming budget for citizen participants to decide how it should be spent. PB often involves 3 stages. First is brainstorming ideas. Next is filtering and refining these ideas. And third is voting on which ideas to fund. PB is really neat because it creates opportunities for people to discuss local needs and develop ideas and solutions, and it helps to fund projects in which people are most interested in. It offers the benefits of deliberation-informed decisions while also providing opportunities for everyone to participate in idea generation and voting on funding allocation. So the report features two cases on PB, one for a larger budget, one for a more modest one. The first is Montreal's participatory budgeting program, in which the city encouraged residents to submit ideas that would contribute to the city's social ecological transition, with 25 million in funding available for the first cycle. And Shawn will go into more detail on this shortly. The other case is Edmonton's community-based budgeting program, which allocated smaller grants to community projects. The next type we looked at is citizen advisory committees, which are a very common institution in municipal councils that they can use to meet with citizens on a policy topic. Citizens are periodically invited to apply for appointment to municipal committees and boards, and appointments are generally made on the basis of their credentials. These committees have been around for ages, but lately we've seen really compelling innovations that seek to make committee membership better reflect the population at large. So in Saskatoon, the appointment practices were reformed to ensure that the Environmental Advisory Committee set aside 2 of its 10 citizen representative seats for groups who are often underrepresented in political decision-making. One seat is reserved for a young person between the ages of 16 and 23, and the other is reserved for a member of a First Nations or Métis community. And in New Westminster, here in BC, the approach to advisory committees has seen even deeper innovation that adopts some of the principles of a citizens' assembly. In response to hearing that committee participants felt like they were listening much more than they contributed, the city launched a pilot to redesign the committee system. They collapsed most committees into one community advisory assembly, and participants were selected from the community, and the demographics of the assembly reflected the demographics of the city as a whole. Participants met around once a month for a year and engaged in both top-down and bottom-up work. While they regularly gave input on proposals shared with them by the city, they also had a chance to develop their own ideas to share with decision makers. And the last structure of public engagement that we look at in the report is consultation. And this is one of the most traditional forms of engaging members of the public. In fact, municipalities often are mandated by provincial legislation to consult the public on certain decisions, such as zoning bylaw changes and updates to the official community plan. While provincial requirements generally leave the format of these consultations up to municipalities, many municipalities often use a public hearing style of consultation to allow members of the public to give their input. But in recent years, some municipalities are going above and beyond this traditional format to conduct consultations that reach further and in more creative ways to include a wider range of residents. In this report, we showcase 2 bold approaches to consultation. First, we look at the work of the public engagement team in Halifax to develop a new climate plan in response to Council's declaration of a climate emergency. Through online tools, in-person forums in libraries and busy pedestrian areas, and through convening a community leadership team, a broad range of input was collected to help shape the city's plan. And lastly, the report showcases a case of including community voices on a technical project for climate adaptation. Vancouver's Sea to Sky Design Challenge convened a community advisory group to give community input, especially from local Indigenous groups, on the design of shoreline adaptation strategies for Vancouver's False Creek. And that's all for me. I hope I've piqued your interest to open up the report and give it a read, and I'll hand it back to you, Hannah.
Is from the Centre d'Ecologie Urbaine. He's the project and development officer in participatory democracy there. As a member of their participatory democracy team since 2022, Shawn has helped accompany local governments and organizations in implementing participatory budgeting processes, and he's helped develop tools and materials to guide municipalities and not-for-profits in designing and running participatory budgeting. So Shawn, I'll hand it over to you to tell us about Montreal's participatory budget.
Thank you very much, Hannah. It's so great to be here. I'm happy to see so many people participating. I even saw a couple names that are familiar to me. Allô, Selma, salut France. Happy that you're both here. So as Hannah said, I'll be talking to you about participatory budgeting. First, I will, of course, share my slides. And I'll just do this. I hope you can all see what I'm sharing at the moment. We're good. So, I am from, as was already presented, the Centre d'écologie urbaine in Montreal. And just very quickly, who we are. We're a nonprofit organization which was founded 30 years ago now, actually, by engaged citizens. It promotes policies and practices to create cities that are environmentally friendly, democratic, and healthy. We work with communities and municipalities across Quebec, which is why we recently lost the de Montréal, which was part of our name for quite a few years. And we also partner with national and international actors. I specifically am from one of our three teams, which works on participatory democracy. So there are other teams working more on urban planning type issues. First of all, it was already said, Megan already presented it quickly, but just to remind people, but participatory budgeting is a democratic process that allows the members of a community to deliberate on and decide how to spend a portion of a public budget. I'll just note that this is not, this is a pretty broad definition because there's a huge diversity of models. Just a very quick history, which you see on the slide at the bottom also, is that it originates in the Brazilian city of Porto Alegre in 1989. And there's a whole story there I could talk about a long time, but I won't because we don't have the time. And it basically spread to thousands of cities on all continents over the last 30 years. And it has taken on a very, very large multiplicity, broad multiplicity of forms, particularly there's a very big difference between the way it's practiced in Latin America and the way the models are in most of the Western world. So just something to sort of keep in mind. This just is a very quick map and it's not complete or necessarily up to date either, but it gives you a very quick idea of how widespread actually participatory budgeting has become, with the caveat that under the term participatory budgeting, there are also a very wide array of practices, some more transformative than others, some more radical than others. So it's interesting to keep that in mind. In Quebec, it's very widespread in Quebec, thanks in large part, I think we can accurately say, to the work that the Centre d'écologie urbaine has been doing on it for nearly 20 years. And we've accompanied now over 30 processes across the province. So we really are, in terms of participatory budgeting in Quebec, there isn't all that much competition in terms of different organizations doing it. A lot of it is concentrated, that expertise is concentrated at the center in terms of at least accompanying different municipalities. We are also a member of People Powered. I saw someone from People Powered was participating, so happy to see that. People Powered, for those who don't know, is an international network of experts and practitioners working to advance participatory democratic practices. They work on all of the models that were already addressed by Megan, so if you don't know them, do check them out. People Powered, I don't know, .net or .org, but just Google it. They're great. All right, now on a quick little, very fast overview of how we got to where we are in Montreal with our participatory budgeting. So around the beginning of the 2000s, there was a series of World Social Forums in Porto Alegre, Brazil. A lot of civil society groups from around the world were there, and when they left, they came back with the story of the participatory budgeting process in Porto Alegre. That inspired the first ever experience in Canada, which was in the borough of the Plateau Mont-Royal in Montreal. And then, unfortunately, it was discontinued for a while. And then things started to sort of pick up again around 2018, 2019 with a few Montreal boroughs, mostly governed by the Projet Montréal Party, which is a party that traditionally has a greater focus on citizen participation and also climate action. It's very much an environmentally focused party. And so we started seeing basically a revival, essentially, under a new model of participatory budgeting. Valérie Plante, the new mayor as of 2017, 2017, no longer new. She's almost finished her last mandate. But she made a visit to Paris, where they have a very significant participatory budget around the beginning of her mandate, and was very inspired. So she came back and wanted to launch a participatory budget. And the first one across the city was in 2021. So this is the one we'll be talking about today. It was the one with the social and ecological theme, and initially had a budget of 10 million, which was later topped up to 25 million after the vote, which is a very rare thing, but in this case, that's what happened. We have now just finished the third edition, so I'll very briefly discuss those at the end, just to give an idea of how it's evolved since the first edition, but I will be focusing on the first one. So here we see an overview of some key numbers and information about the first edition. So the theme, as I already said, was the socio-ecological transition. They divided it with 4 themes, more specific: sustainable and active transit, greening and biodiversity, food and urban agriculture, and inclusive neighborhoods. Each project had to be between 500,000 and 3 million per project. So money-wise, this is quite a significant process as participatory budgets go around the world. The city received 620 ideas. In the end, at the end of the process, there were about 20,000 votes cast, which represents about 1% of the eligible population. We tend to say that for a first edition, a 1% vote doesn't sound like a lot, but it's harder to mobilize than a lot of people would think. And generally, a 1% for a first edition is considered a success, with the idea that it grows every year after that. The first edition was managed to fund 12 projects. And all of the 19 boroughs, Montreal has 19 boroughs, all of them had some projects on their territory. Now, this just gives you an overview of how the process works. Most participatory budgets, at least in the Western world, function more or less along this kind of a model. There are differences in terms of some of the details, but generally it follows this similar process, more or less. Starts with idea collection. It's basically an open brainstorm where often anyone, in Montreal's case, there was no minimum age limit. Anybody could submit an idea, either online or the first year it was during the pandemic, so it was only there were online workshops for the public, but most of the ideas came from the online website. After that, there's a first sort of analysis to ensure eligibility. Generally, this figure is about more or less always around this, like around the ballpark of 50%. So it's kind of normal that it would be only half the ideas eligible. And I'll discuss a little later why a lot of them weren't eligible. Then there's, in Montreal's case, they have mixed committees where it's about 50-50 between municipal officials and representatives of community groups that work together to decide which of the eligible ideas will be prioritized based on certain criteria, usually principles like it could be equity, it could be impact. It varies based on the year. They decide maybe to merge similar ideas to avoid splitting the vote. You don't want, for example, 2 urban agriculture ideas on the ballot because it will split the vote and neither of them is favored by that. So often there's a regroupment that happens there. And then the ideas, which are often very, preliminary or incomplete or maybe not feasible, are then developed with more detail, with more research, etc., through these committee working groups, essentially. Then there's another analysis. This is the city officials that assess the feasibility and costs. Sometimes there might be some final tweaking. And then the ones that are then judged feasible and fall within the budget range are then submitted to the popular vote. So on the right, you see this sort of, we call it a funnel, basically. So it's how you go from 600 ideas down to 35 on the ballot. Usually people can, it varies year by year, but in the first year, I actually don't remember the number of projects you could vote for. I think it was around 10, if I'm not mistaken. You have numerous choices, in other words. And the idea there is to try to find the projects with the broadest support. So without getting too much in the details, in this case, you could vote for up to 10 projects, more or less. It might be 8, I don't remember exactly, but around that. And there's no ranking. You basically just choose the 10 that you support the most, and then the ones that get the broadest support are the ones that are funded. And the idea is that they're implemented within the next 2 years. The idea there is to try to make it tangible for people, so you don't have to wait 10 years to see the effects of your implication. The idea is that if people can see concretely within a medium term the result of their participation, it will motivate you to then want to participate more. So that's an overview of the process. I'll now just quickly present just 3 ideas, 3 examples of projects to give you an overview. There are, of course, 12, so this is just an overview, and that's me in the picture. I believe probably at one of the school voting events, I believe. One of the winning projects in the first year was a project called Montreal's Microforests. $1.4 million, 15 microforests were planted in local parks across 5 boroughs, and that's nearing completion. So that gives you an idea of a project that benefits biodiversity in particular. There's also the Greater Sud-Ouest. The Sud-Ouest is one of the boroughs in Montreal, Southwest. There was an ecological corridor built across 2 boroughs, actually. That's why it's called the Greater Sud-Ouest. And here was the creation of eco-corridors to connect existing biodiversity spaces. So another biodiversity project. And you also see there a panel, basically an informative panel that makes visible the results of the participation. So it will say, this is a project voted on by Montrealers, proposed by Montrealers as part of the participatory budget. And this one is completed. This is another example, rainwater collectors. It's a $3 million project, which involved the plantation of the installation of planting holes and curb extensions with vegetation and drainage at street corners across 3 boroughs. This project is also completed. So this is about sustainable rainwater management. For example, it helps the sewers take less water because they often overflow. Okay, so that's the descriptive part. Now to end, I wanted to sort of just briefly address sort of some of the strengths of the first edition and also some of the lessons learned. So some of the strengths of Montreal's first edition were that we noted participants gained a greater understanding of issues related to the social and ecological transition. It's a very academic, theoretical term. It's difficult to make it sort of real for people and connect it to their daily lives. And we'll see that in the list of challenges. But we did notice that there was progress, at least on that front. Also, the impact of actually was improved by having a theme. So a lot of participatory budgeting processes don't have themes. There's an argument for and against, to be honest, but in this case, we noticed that there were fewer proposals, for example, for leisure, for park equipment, and there were more with ecological benefits. That was the objective, right? Inclusion is, on the one hand, participatory budgeting, because it's not an electoral process, so you don't need to be a Canadian legally, you don't need to be a citizen, you can be a permanent resident, you can just not be a permanent resident. So basically any immigrant, anyone living in Montreal, anyone 12 years and up in this case could vote. So that expands political participation beyond people who can vote in elections. And I think this is probably the biggest strength, is that there's growth potential. A first year is always experimental. You learn lessons. It's very difficult for municipal administrations, particularly of larger cities, because it's a totally new way of planning projects. So the first year is always basically a learning experience with the idea that you improve year after year, you tweak the process, maybe you reform it more broadly than that, and then you upscale the process and the budget to enlarge the impacts, to widen the impacts. That's an important part of participatory budgeting, that it's a cycle, that it comes back every year. Now, challenges, there were quite a few in the first year. Not all of them have been addressed. One is that Montreal's model was particular in the sense that there was no citizen or civil society participation in the design of the process. Now, this is not what we generally recommend. It's important in all public participation, but in particular in participatory budgeting for the community to be actively involved in designing the process, deciding how the public should participate, deciding what the rules are, what the criteria is. This ensures community buy-in and encourages community mobilization and participation, and also trust in the process, right? In this case, Montreal has a very big administrative machine. It's much more complicated. To be fair to the city, it is very difficult, Montreal's governance structures. We have multiple layers also. So it's difficult. And there's a lot of resistance there towards how they might manage to integrate citizens. And that's still a problem or a challenge at the very least today in the participatory budgeting of Montreal. Locally, at the borough level participatory budgets, there is a committee that involves more citizens and civil society. So just to keep in mind, every process is different. Also, a very big limit is that in Montreal, it's only an investment budget, which means that anything involving human resources is not eligible. So that's a very big limit. The city is aware of it. It's also not an easy challenge to overcome, but there have been, we're hopeful that in the next few years, they might find some operating budget to add to it, which would allow for activities and services to also be included. If you think concretely, it's about 40% of those 300 or so ideas that were discarded, that were not judged eligible. Around 40% of them, it was because they implied some kind of human resources upkeep, someone providing services, even, waste management facility, for example, you need people, right, to actually run the installations or provide services to the public. So that's a very wide swath of projects that are no longer possible if you only have an investment budget available. Another challenge is territorial equity. And this is a problem with a lot of participatory processes where populations that are more engaged, often more educated also, and more well-to-do, are the ones that mobilize more. And that favors certain projects in the vote at the expense of other boroughs which have greater needs. So that's difficult. Inclusion is always a hard thing when you don't have, it's not like a citizen assembly where you sample people according to demographics. In this case, it's open participation, which means that people who are less engaged will, by definition, not engage as much. It takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of effort over years to engage these communities, and cities generally don't put the kind of resources into it that would be required. This is the situation in Montreal, though this has very much improved in the last couple of years. And communication, when you pick an issue like social ecological transition, it's very hard to make that resonate with everyday concerns. So that's kind of the downside of having this as a theme. It tends to sort of attract the ones who are already active in environmental issues, and that's a significant challenge to keep in mind. The communication and the way you talk about these issues is very important. So that's an overview of sort of lessons learned. Just quickly to see what's been changed since then. So some of these lessons have been sort of acted on. Notably, there's much greater outreach to youth and vulnerable communities to try to get youth and marginalized communities to engage more and to participate more. There's also they changed the theme to include equity explicitly in the theme to try to address the equity issue. It's still a challenge, but they're trying. And the budget has increased significantly as well, as you can see, year after year, as well as the number of activities, particularly as the first year was during the pandemic. And the result has been a big increase in participation, about a 40% increase in the vote rate this year compared to the first year. So that's a quick overview. I don't know if I was speaking fast. I have a tendency to try to get too much information in a short amount of time, but I hope that that was clear and understandable, comprehensive enough for all of you following.
Thanks so much, Shawn. No, that was great. You packed a lot of info into the brief 15 minutes that we allotted you. So thank you so much. And yeah, a reminder that if you do have questions for Shawn or any of our speakers, that you can feel free to put those in the Q&A, even as they occur to you, or save them until the end. And also a reminder, as Megan already outlined, but our report does include 2 case studies of participatory budgeting. It includes a case study from Edmonton as well. So if you're interested in learning about a slightly different approach to participatory budgeting, then again, please check out the report. But thanks so much, Shawn. And without further ado, we'll hand it over to our second presenter, Robin. Robin Prest leads the Democratic Participation and Innovation team at Simon Fraser University's Morris J. Wosk Center for Dialogue. He served as the principal author for the report, Can Public Participation Accelerate the Transition to Net Zero? And as project director and he also served as project director for the 2017 Citizen Dialogues on Canada's Energy Future, which folks might have heard of. As part of that project, he oversaw and co-designed the first ever cross-Canada deliberative dialogue where a representative body of citizens made recommendations on national energy policies. But today he's going to be speaking to the Burnaby Community Assembly, one of the center's current projects. So Robin, over to you.
Thanks so much, Hannah, and a big shout out to Megan. I really enjoyed reading through the report, and when I was hearing Shawn, your presentation, it really made me think about the value of a report like this and how ideas travel. So hearing about how participatory budgeting came to Montreal is really just maybe a microcosm of the journey we're all on as we harvest these ideas and pass them along. And based on this report, I was able to give a shout out to Montreal's PB process yesterday in a meeting with Metro Vancouver municipalities. So thanks again, everybody, for this work and the opportunity to share. The Burnaby Community Assembly, let's dig in. All right, so the Burnaby Community Assembly focused on one overarching question, and that was how should Burnaby grow and change to create a city where everyone can thrive? So that's an interesting frame to reflect upon as a point of departure, because this was not a climate assembly, but it was an overarching assembly with a broad frame that examined climate alongside other issues. And I'll put a pin in that and I'll come back to it throughout the presentation, because I think it's important as far as understanding where climate fits in and how it can be part of other conversations as well as its own conversation. So I think that Megan gave a great overview of what is a community assembly. I'll talk through the nuts and bolts of this one. In this case, the goal was to present actionable recommendations for Burnaby's official community plan that were made from these participants who broadly reflected the diversity of their communities. I'll pause there and just mention that every participant was invited as their entire person. So although we made sure that we covered certain demographic targets, we also invited people to be their many selves and reflect their many different aspects that make them who they are. And I think that created a really nice tone for the assembly. We wanted to daylight both technical expertise and community expertise. And the assembly became a way that we could share out knowledge that was really important for the entire community to be aware of as well. We wanted to use empathy, and we wanted to reduce this idea of interest-based polarization or people shouting at microphones and really model what consensus building can look like as an alternative to that. And hey, the real kicker about an assembly process and the novelty here, in addition to everything I just said, is that the city, before the process gets underway, formally agrees to respond to the recommendations. So last July, our assembly members presented their 24 recommendations for Burnaby's official community plan to Burnaby City Council. That was done with a celebratory event outside of City Hall. We had about 70 folks from the community come and celebrate that, and then brought this whole pile of people into the council meeting so that council could hear what had come from the assembly. And I think council meetings can often be raucous places, oppositional places, and that was just a ton of positive energy that the assembly brought into that proceeding, which we're really proud of. So let's talk about the civic lottery. Stage one of the civic lottery is essentially we randomly select, with help from Canada Post, a bunch of households within the city to receive invitations. Some of those households, usually around 2 or 3%, respond and register their interest in the assembly. And then stage two of the civic lottery is that we, with the aid of a special computer program, randomly select people who register their interest, and also in a way that balances demographic targets, so that everybody has a chance to participate, but the final outcome is a mini public that reflects broadly the demographics of the city. So we looked at age, we looked at gender identity, language spoken at home, education, owner-renter status, location of residence as far as where in the city you lived, Indigenous identity, and immigration status, essentially how long people have been living in Canada, or if they were born in Canada. And these demographic targets were set in a consultation with an advisory committee. In particular, we had a lot of conversations about the fact that more than half of Burnaby wasn't born in Canada, and that's where some of these targets came from. Also, very multilingual community. And you can see here from just looking at education, the first pie chart shows the demographics of Burnaby. The second pie chart shows who responded to the civic lottery. So you can see that it was very much overrepresented by people with university education who responded their interest to participate. And then through the civic lottery second stage, we brought it back down so that the people with bachelor's degrees or university education mirrored broadly the general population and wasn't overrepresented anymore. So that's why we have the two stages of the civic lottery process. So a bit of journey mapping, and you'll have to excuse me, this is a bit busy, but I've divided this up into different stages to talk us through. So the first stage of the assembly was about understanding Burnaby. We spoke to the city, we asked them what they thought was important to cover in the assembly. We looked at the results of the first round of community consultations that had taken place on the official community plan. And then we did a bunch of one-on-one interviews with city councillors, with community groups, to try to understand if there was anything we were missing, and especially looking at underheard or most impacted voices. And through that, we developed the framing of the assembly, some specific focus questions. We looked at the criteria for what demographics would be looked at with the civic lottery. So very co-created in this process. Second stage, we brought the assembly together after the civic lottery, and they really started with learning about the city, but not only learning, also contributing their knowledge about the city and visioning what they wanted the city to be. After we got through that, we arrived at some early sort of principles-based directions. And then we went out and met with the wider city and had a big ideas workshop where anybody could attend within the city and contribute their ideas for what would make the city a better place to live. We then went to the next stage where the assembly members turned all those ideas into specific proposals or draft recommendations. They did a whole bunch of work to ground truth this as well, and that included inviting different community groups in that had concentrated expertise as far as needs of people experiencing homelessness, experiences of people with disabilities, or different aspects that may or may not have been present within the population that was the assembly. We heard from experts who came and spoke, including city staff who shared their expertise and what it feels like to be sitting in the shoes of a decision maker. And we developed these draft recommendations. A highlight I'll share as well was we went on a bus tour and walking tour of Burnaby to make sure that people really understood like what these concepts look like on the ground. And you'll see Doris there who took us on a walking tour of the Edmonds area. And she was somebody who attended the Big Ideas workshop and said, hey, I don't think you folks have a full understanding of what's going on in Edmonds. Let me show you. And we said yes. And we set aside the agenda for half of the day or part of the day of one of the assemblies. And we went to Edmonds as well as other parts of Burnaby to really make sure we were hearing directly on the ground experiences. So we then put out draft emerging ideas into an online survey. We also did something that I think was really important at this stage. And we heard at the beginning of the assembly that there was this concern that there were many language groups in Burnaby and that some people may not participate in something like an assembly because of language barriers. So we raised this with the city of Burnaby, who had also flagged this for us, this intention of bridging language divides. And we said, hey, we think we can do more here. And the city agreed, as well as the Renovate the Public Hearing initiative, to kick in some extra money. That allowed us to hold self-hosted community conversations within specific language groups. And then we had some language ambassadors who came back to the assembly, shared what they were learning, and also shared that knowledge directly with the city so that it didn't pass through the assembly's filter or didn't only go through the assembly's filter. And that was a really important piece of enhancing equity and voice. Okay, so then finally, we turned all that feedback back into a final set of recommendations that went to City Council. Inputs that went into the assembly. I mentioned some of these already, but I think it's really important, this idea that there's no single source of truth, right? There's many types of knowledge that are important in these conversations. So we had these third-party information sources. We did a lot of learning from a guide that local First Nations has been with the city of Burnaby and the Burnaby Museum to share knowledge that they wanted the community to be aware of. We reached out to the First Nations, host nations, and asked them if there was anything they wanted the assembly to be aware of directly. We reviewed city documentation. We had this input from the general community. We developed a discussion guide and learning materials that helped to create accessible versions of all these, council reports and technical documents. And then we had this interaction with community knowledge holders and technical experts. So all of that, plus the knowledge and lived experience of the assembly members themselves, led to these sets of recommendations. Okay, so I'll share the vision statement that the assembly created. And this was a framework through which the assembly reviewed their action ideas and evaluated were they getting to where they wanted to be. And this included climate change, transportation, housing access and affordability, growth, density, and land use, and livability, belonging, and well-being as the things that they wanted to see in their city. And then at the bottom, you'll see 3 areas that the city of Burnaby itself had identified and that the assembly members integrated into their vision, including reconciliation, climate action and resilience, and then equity, diversity, and inclusion. So these were the frames that the assembly used to guide its directions. I'll share just a couple of reflections right now on why focus on the official community plan and not hold a climate assembly. Both are actually legitimate pathways forward. In this particular case, Burnaby was about to go forward with an official community plan, so it was a perfect process to talk to them about the possibility of an assembly. And I'll just reiterate that all the content that we covered in the assembly was the choice of the assembly members and the community, what they wanted to focus on the most out of all those different baskets of ideas. So there was no agenda here as far as what the assembly needed to believe or think or recommend. And we do a lot of work to make sure that, including looking at the framing we're using with our advisory committee to make sure we're not leading them anywhere. But in this for this particular webinar, I've done some reflections as far as if you're trying to create climate action, or if climate action is a goal within a municipality, what are the relative merits of a climate assembly, which is something that's taking place, especially across Europe right now, it's spreading like wildfire, versus a more generalized assembly like the Burnaby Community Assembly. And I'll say that this wider frame allowed us to look at these complex issues like climate or housing affordability, and look at the interrelationships between those issues, which I think is a real benefit because, essentially, the risk of doing a climate assembly where you have more time to go focused and learn deeply about specific issues, but you also risk coming up with recommendations that fix something for climate, but break something else within the policy goals of the government. And so I wonder, like, I think you can get much more focused, targeted recommendations through a climate assembly, but I think perhaps you get more policy durability through a broad process like this because people have weighed the impacts of different goals they have in relation to each other and come out with where they think that the city needs to go. Really ambitious, though. That the hardest thing we struggled with was packing learning into all these different subject areas into 7 Saturdays that the assembly members had to deliberate and learn and come up with their recommendations. So there are some drawbacks to that approach as well. All right, so 24 recommendations from a climate perspective. I've just summarized some of the things that touch upon climate goals for the city, recommendations for intergenerational decision making, recommendations for essentially active transportation, better sidewalks, more bike routes, dedicated lanes for rapid bus, growth, density, and land use, and then also looking at that social contract of if the city is going to densify, what does it need to deliver for its residents to make that livable and to make that something that's acceptable to them, so that it's not just density for the sake of density. And so these ideas of livability, belonging, well-being were an important piece of talking about that as a package. I'll also share that the city of Burnaby has been spending the last 9 months or so drafting the official community plan, and we're just about to go back to the assembly with a report from the city saying, here's what we did with your recommendations, and here's where they show up. In some cases, the city has indicated that it's fully adopted a recommendation. In other cases, the city said, the recommendation doesn't quite work based on our technical understanding of what the city needs or our area of jurisdiction, but here's something that we propose to do that fulfills the same goals. So that iterative conversation is really important. Of course, the city's got lots of expertise. It's got, the elected officials are accountable for what they do. So there needs to be that conversation. And then the last word is going to be from the assembly, which gets to go back to council this spring and say, and acknowledge the city's response and share any lingering questions or ideas that they have that could make it even better. So a very collaborative process. Evaluation, assembly members were really happy with the process and learned from each other and felt heard, which is what we hope for in a rigorous, intensive process like this. And I'll just give a shout out again to the city of Burnaby as far as, in a way, sticking its neck out to do something that a city hadn't done before. When they agreed to do this, they were really a trailblazer in doing something like this within BC or within Canada. There have been assemblies by cities in Canada, certainly, but not necessarily on an official community plan until that a couple of municipalities went in that direction this spring, or sorry, last year. Including Burnaby. And assemblies, although citizens' assemblies began in British Columbia with that specific format in the BC Citizens Assembly on Electoral Reform, it's popularized and spread, and the OECD has tracked its spread around the world in what it's called a deliberative wave. But in some ways, we're repatriating this back to British Columbia now and making it a more regular appearance. And in fact, there were, by last count, around 5 community assemblies on different topics hosted by different groups within BC last year, which is really, really exciting to see that deliberative wave coming home again. All right, so I'll end it there.
Thanks so much, Robin. That was really fantastic. Yeah, especially interesting those considerations around how do you set the proper scope in terms of climate or like zooming in on climate versus considering the broader interconnected issues. Yeah, thank you so much. And without further ado, we'll move into questions. A reminder that we're going until quarter after today, so we hope that folks can stay on for a little bit of discussion. I saw that there were already a couple questions about the participatory budget from Gabby. Oh, and it just disappeared.
It's
Oh,
because
I
I was
see. So,
answering in the chat. Yeah,
okay, great.
sorry.
Well, do you want to speak to either of those, Shawn? I think especially the question
Sure.
around hesitations, I think is
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, I think yeah, the city. I mean, I personally wasn't involved in the first edition. First thing to say, and I wasn't present in the discussions with city officials. And often, if we are, it's sometimes confidential also. But I mean, I can say that one of the main concerns, as I understand, was around territorial equity. So it's sort of the issue I already presented, where you have, let's say one part of the city, a couple boroughs where they have much fewer resources. It's more these are vulnerable communities, underrepresented communities. I'm thinking of Montreal North, for example, Montreal Nord, which is one of the poor areas of Montreal, high level of immigration. And unfortunately, because of their demographic weight or the fact that the people who live there don't mobilize as much in the voting process, they end up being unfavored. And so year after year, that part of the island has been very disappointed by the outcomes because they feel like they mobilize, they push for things that, objectively speaking, are probably greater needs. We're talking about food security, we're talking about things like that. But in the end, it's the areas of the city where there's a longer tradition of participation, where people are more educated, have more time, have the social capital, if you want to use that term, the civic capital. Places where like the Plateau Mont Royal and Rosemont, which are known for being sort of the stronghold of more environmental movements, they tend to mobilize more, and so they end up being favored in the vote. So there's a lot of concerns about that, not just on the part of the city officials, but also from local elected councillors who are from some of these areas and are saying, "Hey, we have, needs here. We have significant needs. What are you doing? Building, I don't know." Leisure equipment in parks when we have people with serious food insecurity issues. So there's always this question of how, on the one hand, to allow the process to be open and participatory, but how, on the other hand, to ensure that the communities that have the greatest needs end up getting favored in the process. And this is where the huge difference between, for example, the Brazilian model of participatory budgeting really comes in. And it's not just the model, it's also the context. I mean, if you look at the history of the Brazilian participatory budgeting, it was very much a popular movement which emerged from the poorest neighborhoods. And so when you look at the assemblies there, the majority of people hadn't even finished primary school. Whereas here, you look at the people who vote, and this is the case across the Western world. It's not something particular to Montreal. The people who vote are generally highly educated. The vast majority are university educated people. So, this is where the debate between open participation versus something like a citizen assembly, where it's much more representative, this comes in. Participatory budgeting is not a panacea. It's important to say it. I mean, it could be very interesting, but there are significant questions to be asked around equity in the process. There are ways to address it. They have interesting things in Madrid and Paris, for example, where they devote certain envelopes to the poorest communities. There are some mechanisms you can instill, but it's always imperfect. So it's not an either or, I like to say. I like to use the term that Josh Lerner, the executive director of People Powered, uses, where he talks less about waves. It's not, the answer isn't participatory budgeting or citizen assemblies. It's all of the above. It's an ecosystem. They're complementary. So I'll end on that thought.
Yeah, thanks, Shawn. So much in there. I think I'll hand it to you, Robin, I guess, for the similar question, though, around were there any hesitations expressed by the municipality or other challenges like that you experienced with the assembly?
Yeah, we were really lucky in that we had worked with the city of Burnaby previously on housing and done some things that were maybe a bit more edgy or unusual for a municipality and got to trust each other through that process. And they were an enthusiastic yes when we came to them with this idea. We had some grant money and they kicked in some money and Van City and yeah, we created a funding envelope together to make it work. What I will say though is that I think the work that Megan's been doing for compiling these case studies is so important because of course every government is risk adverse. It's their job to make sure stuff doesn't fall apart. And trying something new is risky. But if another city has done this before and we can share and look at that as being something that was successful, it de-risks that sort of innovation for everyone else. So just, yeah, I want to shout out again the report from Megan.
Yeah, wonderful. A question about compensation, which I think Megan just answered. I wonder, Robin or Shawn, if you want to speak to the specifics. It was a question, are citizens compensated for their time, either in participatory budgeting or citizen assembly engagement process? And Megan says yes, generally. Robin or Shawn, do you want to speak to?
Yeah, just quickly, in participatory budgeting, it's often not the case, unfortunately. The exception is in Montreal's case, if there's a prolonged implication, for example, a committee, the members of the committee are remunerated. So in this case, the mixed committees between city officials and community groups, the representatives of community groups were remunerated. But your everyday citizen who comes to a workshop is not. I don't know of many examples where they are, but there might be in Paris or in Europe, I'm not sure, but not in Montreal.
Yeah. And community assemblies. In Canada, there's been a sort of a raging sort of argument about whether or not it's a requirement. From my perspective, it is wherever possible. We used a living wage for the time spent in the room as our sort of indicator for setting an honorarium. But we had to pay that out of the part of the budget that came from the Center for Dialogue and other funders because it's harder for a municipality to set a precedent as far as why it's paying for something and not other sorts of committees. And I think that's an area where municipalities are needing to learn as well. And across their different advisory committees, I think this is an area of reflection and growth within municipal governance as we're asking citizens to play more and more important roles.
Yeah, that makes sense. And even as well as Shawn was talking about, like that it's not, these processes aren't a panacea that are able to necessarily address all structural inequities. While I'm sure compensation is important for enabling people to participate, that it's also not, of course, like the only barrier by any means that people might face. I think that we might have just time for one more question quickly. Um, and this one I think can be open for whichever of the three of you wants to speak to it. It's a question about how cities have limited budgets and jurisdictional responsibilities, and that, of course, some of the recommendations from people participating in these processes might fall to a different jurisdictional level. So Anna Hardy is asking, do you know of opportunities for participatory democracy at the provincial level? And also, how do you communicate different responsibilities of, I guess, the government in question that your process is aimed at, as well as budgetary limitations? Maybe just given time, if there's one of you that wants to speak to that, then.
I don't know, Robin, if you wanted to, I could
Well,
jump in if not. But
I
yeah.
don't think Megan's had a chance in
That's
the
okay.
Sure,
I'm
yeah.
actually really interested to hear, Robin, what you would have to say about people who requested things in the Burnaby Assembly that were just out of the municipality's control. Was there any response given to explain that, or any efforts made to like connect to provincial funding?
Yeah, this is a really hard one. We did educate or provide information about jurisdiction and had some back and forth with the city and the assembly about that. Some of the assembly members' recommendations go into these areas of, shared responsibility, housing, childcare, and it's muddled because every level of government kicks in a little bit for some of these things, right? And cities are very sensitive to the downloading from other levels of government. And if you're a resident, frankly, you don't care. You just want somebody to solve the problem. And if you have an opportunity to say so, you're going to. I do think that if we can bridge jurisdictions in these sorts of processes, that would be really cool, or make sure that information flows from one jurisdiction to another when they hear something that's relevant. And yes, absolutely, federally, provincially, any level of government can commission these types of processes, and it can be really powerful.
Um, well, I think that we'll leave it there since we're right on time. Thank you so much for the questions from the participants here, and thank you so much for attending our webinar today. And thanks to Robin, Shawn, and Megan for speaking today, as well as Zoe for giving us a welcome at the beginning. Adam, I think, has dropped the link to the report again in the chat. So please grab that before you go. Again, it's available in both English and French. We'll be sending out an email that will include also the link to download the report, as well as the recording from today's session, and more information about our speakers and how to learn more about their work as well. So I think that's it for today. Thank you so much to everybody, and I hope that this was as inspiring and invigorating for everybody as it was for me.
Thank you very much to Climate Reality for organizing this. Thanks to Megan. Thanks to everyone who came. This was a great conversation. It was really a lot of fun.
Thank you.